the book provides, I think, a rigor in its analysis of the Coalitions for Change program's activity, especially from 2012 up through 2016, 2017, 2018, really. Rigorous in two ways. First of all, it's rigorous in the sense that it provides an in-depth, blow-by-blow process tracing of the ways in which various teams and partners of the program have proceeded on a diverse range of fronts as they've pursued different reform agendas through policy reform advocacy campaigns of one kind or another since 2012. And this process tracing has really gone from the beginning of each one of these initiatives on to one or another form of closure, achievement, or in some cases abandonment of the initiative, doing so on the basis of a multiplicity of sources, in-depth interviews with key participants, and also documentary research, as well as a broader contextualization of these different CFC reform initiatives on the basis of shared knowledge and understanding of Philippine politics and Philippine society, shared between myself and my co-author, Jaime Faustino. The book's also rigorous in its analysis in the sense that it not only looks at these processes through a careful tracing exercise that includes a kind of counterfactual analysis of what could have happened differently, thus trying to capture more closely and specifically when and where CFC's activities and actors made a real difference that had a concrete impact on policy reform that can be established through that kind of detailed process tracing. But in addition to this, a kind of comparative analysis, looking over a succession of chapters at different kinds of reform initiatives and activities undertaken by CFC, and comparing them in terms of their varying impact and effectiveness, their varying sustainability, their varying success. So to give you some examples in concrete terms of how the book proceeds, let's begin with Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, the book looks at the famous episode in 2012 of so-called syntax reform, in which CFC helped to promote through its partner Action for Economic Reforms a successful campaign in Congress with the support of the Philippine government under then-President Aquino to drastically raise excise taxes on tobacco products in particular, as well as alcohol to a lesser extent, but cigarettes in particular, in ways which led not only to a great revenue gain for use in particular for the government's universal health care program, but also in terms of health, helped to reduce smoking in the Philippines alongside its benefits for public health care programs sponsored by the government. And we look closely in the chapter at the specific ways in which CFC's partners really waged a successful campaign in Congress against a set of vested interests, big tobacco, and other obstacles to the effective passage of legislation that really seriously raised excise taxes on cigarettes. And we show that various forms of resistance were overcome. We can look at, in the chapter, specific alternative bills which were outmaneuvered in Congress, and various legislators who stood in the path of successful tax reform to see how this unfolded. And then in Chapter 3, we move on to look at various elements of land governance reform, in which CFC picked up an agenda that had really been developed at least 10 years earlier by a diverse range of experts on land governance, with sustained institutional and financial support from the Australian government through the Australian Agency for International Development, AUSAID as it was then known, and the Asian Development Bank and USAID, and how CFC, beginning in 2012, picked up this agenda for stronger land governance institutions, in particular a drastic reform of land titling procedures in the Philippines. And it made quite considerable and impressive progress on an agenda that had been developed years earlier but had largely been abandoned because of the obstacles and impediments to reform that had been discovered under preceding waves of kind of reform advocacy campaigns. So in other words, just as in Chapter 2 with tax reform, we see the government's efforts to push excise tax reform effectively assisted and brought to achievement and eventual implementation in considerable measure thanks to CFC and its partners. We likewise find in Chapter 3 with land governance reform an existing agenda that CFC picks up and brings to fruition with the passage of new laws and other new regulations and undertakings by key government agencies working in the area of land governance. But in both of these instances, as seen in Chapters 2 and 3, we see pre-existing reform agendas from outside the program that the program picks up and promotes effectively, demonstrating something in terms of a capacity for assisting and effectively undertaking a reform agenda that's previously been developed, not by the program itself, but by other actors, which is all to the good, but it's not everything. But then when you move to Chapter 4, we see the program actually coming up with its own new reform agenda. So in Chapter 4, we look at the problem of so-called school congestion, which is by 2012, the Philippine government is realizing that school classrooms are more and more crowded, especially in some parts of the country, with more and more students crowding in the same classroom. Thus, in some cases, forcing schools to hold 3 different shifts over the course of a day to accommodate as many as 100 students in a single classroom over a 24-hour period. And CFC begins to investigate this as it's tasked to look at education as one of its priorities for reform, understanding very well that there is this problem of rising school congestion, but also understanding the kind of puzzling reality that this problem is persisting despite the Philippine government committing considerable resources to building more classrooms. And so by closely investigating this problem, CFC, its team on education reform, comes to the realization that the problem lies not in the lack of funding for classroom construction, but the lack of land. That the binding constraint on effective decongestion of schools has to do with something that no one else had really picked up on. And so the program on its own undertakes to assist the Department of Education in developing a new set of procedures and institutions and mechanisms for something quite difficult, the purchase of land. Something which precisely in those built-up congested areas, urban and suburban areas where school congestion is most acute, is quite complicated procedurally and requires a great deal of initiative and innovation. And over a few years, thanks to CFC's innovative, iterative approach to reform, a set of procedures and developments and new institutions and budgetary provisions are created within the Department of Education that finally enable the Department of Education to overcome this otherwise ignored and otherwise insurmountable barrier to actually dealing with school congestion. So those are chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the book. And over the subsequent chapters, we look at a range of other initiatives in electoral reform, in different forms, in disaster risk reduction and management, in infrastructure reform, and in conflict resolution efforts in the southern Philippines. And we look at a range of different reform programs across these different policy arenas of varying success, shall we say. Some more successful, some more impressive, some more sustainable than others. And we see that, as in the three cases I've discussed of tax reform, land governance reform, and education reform, that really there are a variety of different ways in which CFC has proceeded, a variety of different levels of innovation and of adaptability and of effectiveness in terms of picking up a pre-existing agenda or developing its own agenda with more or less innovation, adaptation, and effectiveness and impact across a range of different policy arenas. So what I think we show in the book is that the program has some considerable, impressive, commendable achievements to its name. We show that it has operated across a wide range of different issue areas, and we've also shown that the results vary. And in doing so, we suggest that it's in those areas where CFC's teams and partners operate with the greatest autonomy from pre-existing agendas from outside the program that CFC pushes itself to the highest levels of adaptability, innovation, sometimes ambition, and effectiveness and impact. And that suggests something significant for other kinds of programs which, like CFC, are thinking and working politically, as the title of the book suggests, that are engaged in forms of policy reform promotion through advocacy campaigns and other activities, whether in the legislature or in the executive branch, in a country like the Philippines or otherwise. And this suggests, it seems to me, two things. One, that there is good reason to engage in further experimentation with thinking and working politically in settings like the Philippines and otherwise, through the promotion of policy reform, advocacy campaigns and initiatives in different ways that involve the complex and contingent processes of reform advocacy through a mix of insider access, expertise, sometimes campaigning in the public sphere, in the media and otherwise, depending on the issue area and the political context. But finally, it seems to me that the book helps to show that you can engage in this kind of highly complex, contingent, and often very drawn-out kind of development work through promotion of policy reform in a way that can be rigorously analyzed, assessed, and otherwise understood and open to external view by independent analysts, academics, and others who may be sympathetic but also capable of constructive criticism of existing approaches and existing activities as they're being undertaken in real time. And for someone who has worked now since 2012 from outside the program, what I've been impressed by, among many other things, is the openness and honesty of this program and those working under its rubric to open their books and open their minds and their mouths to an outsider such as myself, to analyze critically, rigorously, comparatively, with an insider like my co-author Jaime Faustino, the various programs, initiatives under CFC, and to look at the varying success in a serious, honest, critical way. And this suggests to me, and hopefully after reading the book to you, that programs like this can be undertaken elsewhere in a way that can be assessed, evaluated, and understood from outside their programs' own management teams, And by opening these programs to this kind of external scrutiny, by documenting their own work and allowing others to do so, we can see that thinking and working politically in development can really be undertaken and rolled out more broadly in a serious and sustainable way by various overseas development agencies and multilateral institutions across the global South. Thank you.